line under claims of inappropriate behaviour. That's after he was cleared by an independent investigation. His accuser is understood to have been suspended. And later in the programme, I speak to self-proclaimed global feminist Annie Lennox on the eve of International Women's Day. And after the Home Office reversed their visa decision, a private performance from the Afghan youth orchestra were tonight playing their first show. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. I want you to pause for a moment and imagine this. Imagine being so malnourished that you can't breastfeed your newborn baby. Imagine having no idea how you'll keep your children or yourself from going hungry. Occasionally, you hear about an aid truck coming in or an airdrop being done by a foreign government, but little or none of that food makes it into your hands. That's the dilemma facing thousands of people in the north of Gaza. Doctors say children are dying of starvation, 13 last week in one hospital. In fact, the humanitarian crisis is so severe that this evening the White House confirmed the US military would construct a floating pier within weeks to deliver more aid by sea. Yes, that's right. America, which is providing ammunition for Israel's war in Gaza, will ask hundreds of its soldiers to take part in an emergency mission to help prevent mass starvation. Starvation caused, at least in part, by the war the US is helping to fund. If that feels back to front, well, because it is. That's the reality of diplomacy right now. The aid will be shipped in from Cyprus. In a moment, I'll ask a spokesperson for the Israeli government how much support they'll give to the mission. But let's get started tonight in Jabalia in northern Gaza. A warning, there are distressing images coming up in Alistair Bunkle's report.
They lost 13 babies in this hospital in a single day last week. All of them died from malnutrition. They literally starved to death in a place where they should have been safe. Another baby died from lack of oxygen because the hospital's solar panels have stopped working. The medical staff have to use the torch of a mobile phone for light. This is how it is now at the only paediatric hospital still functioning in northern Gaza.
The mothers cannot breastfeed and boost their baby's immune system due to them suffering from malnutrition themselves. So how can they breastfeed their babies? Nothing can substitute breastfeeding for babies under 1 year. This is the most difficult thing we encounter with the children.
Hundreds of thousands of people remain in northern Gaza. This is the daily scramble for the little aid that is getting there. There is no sign of authority or order. It's chaos.
We haven't seen anything from the aid. Nothing at all. Nothing, no flour, no nothing. Ever since we arrived here 5 months ago, we have not received even 1 kilogram of flour or 1 kilogram of sugar. We have received nothing.
The US has said that Israel must do more to get aid into Gaza. And the UK has told Israel it is their responsibility under international law as the occupying power. But Israel insists it is doing all it can to get more aid into Gaza and blames aid organisations for not distributing it more effectively. But in a frank admission, the Israeli body which controls the Gaza border has told Sky News that more crossings could be opened for aid directly into the north if the Israeli government gave the order. In theory, could you open up more crossings, more land crossings, directly into the north, for example?
Again, so that would be a decision that needs to be made, as you mentioned, by the government. And if they were to make such a decision, then we would find a way to facilitate their decision. But at the moment...
So you could do it? If you were given the orders or the instructions to do so, that could happen?
If the directive came from the government, then COGAT would find a way to fulfill that mission, as we've done with many different humanitarian initiatives throughout the war.
In southern Gaza, children queue with their pots for a helping of beans scooped from a barrel. For many of them, it will be the only meal they eat in the day. It's no longer just the war they're running from. Hunger stalks them. A famine is looming. And this is Rafah, where the Israeli military wants to invade next.
Every day there are people who die from starvation. Every day children are taken to hospitals, but there are no services available. Because hospitals have no medicine, no beds, no equipment, no treatment, the situation is very bad. What aid? We're talking about a drop in the ocean. We're not getting aid. You see 1 or 2 trucks entering and think there is aid getting in?
When they distribute meals, a family of 10 gets 1 serving. Not enough for anybody. We won't eat if we rely on that. True, they are helping people, but it is not enough. There are crowds wherever you go, queues to get water, bread, everything. Life is so difficult. We can barely get by. I cannot provide for myself. I don't know what to do. I cannot feed my children.
There have been more aid drops into Gaza, underlining how difficult it is to get aid distributed by road. There is a growing disagreement between Israel and its closest allies. Stuck in the middle of that are millions of Gazans growing more desperate by the day. It seems that only a ceasefire now can bring an end to this misery. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News.
Well, let's get some analysis now. Our US correspondent Mark Stone joins us from Washington. But first, let's go to our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, who joins us from Jerusalem. And Dom, those images coming out of Gaza are just gut-wrenching as a result of no aid reaching these desperate people.
Yeah, and the Israelis say that there is no huge need for more aid to go in. Despite all those scenes, they say more than enough is getting into Gaza. It's just that the UN and other aid agencies are not doing enough to distribute it. And this decision by Joe Biden to build a port in Gaza, extraordinary decision that we've just heard tonight, is him effectively saying he doesn't buy any of that. He's saying that the situation is so dire that he's got to send American forces into harm's way, potentially, because of the failures and shortcomings of Israel during this war. And I think Israel has said it's going to coordinate this and cooperate with it, as well it might, because it means this aid coming in from Cyprus will have been screened there. And it raises the possibility of America getting drawn deeper into this and possibly having some kind of role at the end of the conflict, which the Israelis would like. But there are so many questions. Who's going to guarantee the security of Americans from the potential of a deliberate attack by any number of jihadi or mujahideen groups in Gaza? Who's going to protect them from a mistaken attack? And why is this necessary? There is the crossing of Erez in the north of Gaza, the ports of Ashkelon and Ashdod, and aid could be landed from Cyprus to there and then funneled into Gaza that way, instead of building a port with all the dangers that are ensuing from that. And the bigger question, of course, is it going to happen quickly enough? Americans are good at building this kind of infrastructure, but not quickly. 93% of Gazans face crisis levels of hunger, and they simply don't have that long to wait.
Dom, thank you so much for that update there from Jerusalem. Let's go to the United States now and speak with our Mark Stone. Mark, as Dom was saying there, a significant announcement, but so many questions remain.
So many questions, logistical questions, political questions, and you actually wonder whether officials in the US administration are seeing the same images that the rest of the world is seeing. I remember having a conversation with an Israeli military official back in November in Israel. And he said to me then, there is no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. There was then, and it is now orders of magnitude worse. And it is so clear now that the Americans are unable to persuade the Israelis to open those borders. It's quite extraordinary, but it seems to be the case. There is a suggestion today that the Americans say they have now persuaded Israel to open one other border crossing in the north. It hasn't happened yet. That's probably Erez. But there are so many other crossings as well, unofficial ones, holes in the fence. We went through them when we were in Gaza in November with the IDF. These are the fences through which the Israelis are taking in their own military. military and hardware, and yet they're unwilling to take in any humanitarian aid. There's a political dimension to this too. It's Joe Biden's State of the Union address tonight, once every year. This year, it's make or break for him. It's his moment to mould himself as the future president. Gaza is a key problem for him. It's causing him massive domestic issues as well, and it's obvious why he has decided to make this, honestly, quite desperate policy announcement at his speech tonight.
Indeed. Mark, thank you so much for all of your analysis there. Well, joining me now is Avi Hyman, a spokesperson for the Israeli government. Thank you so much, Mr. Hyman, for joining us here on the programme. It's quite an extraordinary move, a significant one, that the United States has felt that it needs to build this seaport within the next few weeks. But the question is, why was this even necessary?
Thank you very much for having me on. I'll tell you categorically that there are no limits on the amount of aid that can go into Gaza. I'll say that again. There's no limits on the amount of aid that can go into Gaza. Now, what we've said to our allies and friends around the world is, if you bring it, we will ship it in. The problem isn't getting aid into Gaza, it's the distribution of aid once it's in Gaza. And that's a problem as
Mr. Hyman, that's not what the United States is saying. That's not what your staunchest of allies is saying. They're saying more needs to be done, that Israel ultimately is the occupying power on the ground. And it's up to you to ensure that people don't starve.
Well, that's exactly what I'm saying, is that we are working on improving the distribution, because until now that was run by the UN agency UNRWA, which is a front for Hamas, which was using Hamas to protect them, quote, protect them. We know that Hamas was stealing that aid. We know that.
So here on this program, just yesterday, I had Jan Egeland, the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council, who was just in Gaza, and he talked about the number of trucks banked up as a result of Israeli vetting, going through absolutely everything, which of course is your prerogative, and no one is saying that you should compromise your security. Certainly your allies are not saying that, but every single one of your staunchest allies are saying that our patience is wearing thin. And the fact that tonight the United States has had to announce this is really quite extraordinary, that they don't buy the narrative that you are selling, that it's up to the UN and they haven't done a good enough job.
This week, a record amount of trucks went through, 277 trucks in one day. We're doing our utmost to get the supplies in, but like I said, Hamas is doing their utmost to steal them, just like Hamas is embedded within and underneath their population.
But the standards that the world holds the Israeli government should surely be different to the standards we hold Hamas to. As you say, they are a group that launch all sorts of attacks, and yet just last week we saw over 100 Palestinians killed as a result of gunshot wounds because of aid truck entering the area, and utter chaos. This is not what the world expects from the IDF. It's not what the world expects from the Israeli government.
I can't confirm those numbers, and I can't confirm what you just said. What I can tell you is, yes, there is a humanitarian crisis of sorts in Gaza, because Hamas launched a war against us, coming over our borders, beheading, raping as a weapon, burning entire families alive. We have to defend ourselves. This is an existential war. We are fighting for our very existence. Hamas has made it clear.
No one's questioning that, sir, but under your watch, 16 babies should not die of starvation. One just 47 days old, who died just a couple of weeks ago.
War is absolute hell. And I feel for the civilians that have got caught up in this war on both sides. Civilians shouldn't have to die as war, but we didn't choose this war. We didn't want this war. Hamas launched this war on us. And
we didn't choose this war, but there are responsibilities that a state like Israel needs to adhere to.
And we are doing our absolute utmost to get as much aid in, to change the distribution. We're working now with the private sector. We're working with our allies around the world. You've seen the airdrops. You've reported these reports about the Americans bringing in aid by sea as well.
And you'll ensure that the Americans have said they don't want troops, any boots on the ground. So they will be relying on Israel, the occupying power in Gaza, to ensure that hundreds of people don't die trying to get access to flour.
Well, let's make it clear. Israel is in control of all of the aid that's going in, all of the airdrops, everything going in. And we will continue. And we'll continue every day we're getting better at distribution. But Hamas is trying to steal that aid. They have actively stole that aid. No one is going hungry if they're a Hamas fighter. Those people are underground while their people are suffering. Their leaders are living at large in Qatar and making statements about our hostages, the 134 hostages, men, women, children, babies being held, a crime against humanity. They're speaking about them from Qatar. They're speaking about them from Istanbul in posh hotels while their people are suffering. The finger needs to point to Hamas. Hamas could put their hands in the air and surrender tomorrow and give back those 134 Israelis. And the reality would be very, very different in Gaza. But that's not what Hamas wants. Hamas wants their people to suffer so that they put pressure on the international community.
Mr. Hyman, ultimately, I have to go back to what your staunchest of allies are saying, and they're saying you're not doing enough. Ultimately, that is the reality. They are saying that Israel needs to do more. Whatever you may say about the UN or Hamas, today, there are 30,000 people who have died as a result of this war. There are babies starving. There are children on the brink of famine. The UN and various other agencies, you can say all you want that that's not happening, but that is what your staunchest of allies are saying today.
Those are Hamas figures. I can tell you categorically.
The US president is using it. So is the US president lying?
We have killed over 12,000 terrorists, mainly Hamas fighters, also.
And 18,000 civilians.
No, those are Hamas figures that cannot be.
The US president, we heard, Lloyd say 25,000 women and children have died in this conflict.
I believe, I could stand corrected. Please fact check me, but I'm pretty sure those statements will walk back. These numbers cannot be confirmed. What I can tell you is Hamas is doing their utmost to get civilians caught up in the war, because that's how they will stay in power.
You will point the finger of blame at Hamas, and that's fair enough. And as I said, your allies have said you need to defend yourself. That is not the question here. But when civilians are being starved as a result of Israel's failure, that is where the problem lies. And the fact that the Americans have had to create a seaport today because they want to bypass Israel, but having to also rely on Israel, it is significant and extraordinary.
We welcome our allies' support in getting more aid to the people that need it, not to the Hamas fighters. We will work with our allies. But
no one wants the food to go to Hamas, not your allies, not you, but they do want it to go to starving babies.
Right. I'm seeing pictures of starving babies from the civil war in Syria. The year is 2024. Gaza is not in Syria. I've seen that posted by senior Palestinian officials. I've seen terminally ill children dying in Gaza. Terminally ill children sadly die around the world. I've seen Gazans receiving aid from American airdrops and throwing it in.
38,000. We know the population of Gaza. There's over 2 million people living there. So the fact that the Americans have had to use the most difficult means to enter Gaza and deliver aid, this is the most ineffective way, when in fact they should be able to work with the Israelis. If you don't trust the UN, if you don't trust any other body, including the Egyptians, surely you have faith in the Americans so that they can use one of your border crossings, the Erez border crossing, for example. Why isn't that open?
The Erez border crossing was the main crossing used by Hamas. They destroyed much of it when they came through butchering our people. The Kerem Shalom crossing is being used. The Nitzana crossing is being used to check at an incredible rate. We've got record amounts of aid that went through this week. We've got the airdrops. Now you're talking about the new American plan that could potentially become a reality soon. We are doing our utmost. What could you imagine Britain dropping aid into Germany in late 1940s?
This is often used as an example whenever I speak to Israeli officials. But the truth is that your allies today expect better from you. And they are criticizing the way in which that aid is being received and distributed. Ultimately, you are the occupying power. We will have to leave it there. But I'm grateful for your time, Mr. Hyman.
Thank you very much.
OK, let's bring in this evening's panellists. Jasmine El-Gamal, political analyst and former Middle East advisor to the US Department of Defense, and Jake Wallace-Simons, editor of the Jewish Chronicle and author of Israelophobia. Thank you very much for joining us. I was trying to make sense of that great title. Jake, there is frustration. Whatever Israel says tonight, we are seeing images of babies dying, and that is not a good look for Israel, frankly.
Absolutely, and I think that Hamas knows that, which is why there's censorship in the Gaza Strip, which controls which images leave, which is one of the reasons why we never see any images of dead or wounded Hamas fighters, only civilians. But let's leave that aside for a moment. I think that if we look at the reasons why this humanitarian crisis is taking place, there's a suggestion or sort of an implication that Israel somehow wants civilians to suffer. I think that's untrue. I think that the two reasons behind it are significant logistical problems and a political vacuum. On the logistical side, I mean, for the Israelis to go in and have contact daily with the civilian population and dole out aid to them would put their soldiers at risk of Hamas elements hiding in the crowds, which could lynch soldiers and kidnap them, which we know is a war aim of Hamas. So it's very difficult for the Israeli armed forces to do that, and again, without getting mobbed and having to fire in the air, which then creates a potential escalation. So it's got to be international forces that deliver the aid in some way, or local clans or people in Gaza.
Right? They're the occupying force. They're the dominant power. They are among the best military in the world.
I mean, they've got.
Of
course, I mean, they've got the ability to control what goes in and what goes out, and
then to manage it on the ground as well.
To manage it on the ground is a different matter because they are prosecuting a war here. You've got crowds of civilians who are entirely in a lawless environment. The police have been taken out.
But babies in hospitals?
Gangs.
Babies in hospitals?
I think it's important not to underestimate the logistical difficulties of Israeli soldiers going into crowded civilian areas. We saw just the other day those lorries being mobbed by crowds of civilians, which ended up in that tragedy. And so it would make much more sense for international forces that don't provoke Hamas elements to come out and lynch them and kidnap them to be able to administer that aid, and hopefully that's what we're seeing via the US.
I'm just going to bring in Jasmine. Jasmine, I mean, just your thoughts. Does Jake have a point here? The images we're seeing are devastating. But for Israel, they don't want to put their soldiers in harm's way, so therefore they are not personally delivering this aid, but it's resulting in starvation.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of conflicting things that your previous guest was saying from the Israeli government when it comes to aid. First of all, it is unequivocally false that the Israeli government is doing everything it can to let aid into Gaza. That has been the case since day one of the war. Part of the reason why the situation is so bad right now is because these people in Gaza haven't been getting any food. You remember that before October 7th, there was about 500 trucks a day that was going into Israel. That number is nowhere near that, and we're 5 months into this war. And so the chaos and the confusion and everything that we're all, hearing and talking about, that didn't just appear. That is not the steady state in Gaza. Confusion and starvation. This happened because for the last 5 months, they have not been getting the proper assistance. I've been talking to people who work in aid organizations who are talking about things like this is according to the Jordanians, actually. So the IDF will not let, and fair enough, anything that they deem as dual use across the border. So it means that something that could be used for humanitarian forces. Yes, yeah. But however, if you look at some of the things that are being held up, we're talking about sleeping bags because they have zippers on them. The Jordanians just reported that dates that you eat are being not allowed because they have the pits in them. I mean, what are the pits going to be used for? And so we have all of these. There is a reason. My bottom line is, it doesn't do much good to talk about numbers and whether these numbers are real or these photos are real. The fact is, we have a problem of starvation that is so monumental that the American government has to bypass its own ally as if they're in Sarajevo to do airdrops to feed people so that more children don't die of starvation.
Jake, I mean, that is quite an extraordinary thing that which I put to Mr. Hyman as well. The fact that their staunchest ally has to now bypass them to... I mean, ultimately, it is going to have to be Israel that distributes this, because the Americans have said we're not going to put boots on the ground.
Well, the Americans aren't going to put boots on the ground, but that doesn't necessarily mean the Israelis will do so. I mean, hopefully there'll be some cooperation with the emerging ruling bodies in Gaza, like the local clans who are beginning to take a modicum of control in some areas, maybe some Arab forces, something like that. But I think that the point I was about to make earlier is that there has been a political vacuum in Israel when it comes to planning for the next day, for what happens after the conflict. Really, the next day is now. And if some proposals had been taken forward, for example, humanitarian islands, setting aside areas of the Gaza Strip that were defended, perhaps even by some Arab forces, for humanitarian aid to be submitted to be distributed from there, that might have helped.
I mean, that's the thing, the Arab states are saying we're not going to do that. They're not going to point guns at Palestinians. Ultimately, it's going to be the responsibility of Israel.
It sounds like you're calling for a proper occupation of Gaza Strip by Israel. I mean, Israel doesn't want to do that. Israel doesn't want to take full occupation.
Prime Minister Netanyahu has said this himself. It's not me saying it. These aren't my statements.
I think we need...
The Prime Minister has said that for now, they're going to be the occupying force, and they do have the boots on.
I'm not here to talk on behalf of Prime Minister Netanyahu. All I'm saying is that I think that if we look at what we want to happen, we want aid to get to innocent Gazans, not to get to Hamas, which has been the case often with Hamas stealing it, as Mr. Hyman said, and hiding it underground. We don't want that. We don't want mass casualties. We don't want confrontations of thousands of civilians with Israeli soldiers that are going to cause chaos and bloodshed and lynchings and even beheadings
or
kidnappings.
Pick up on the point
we want to have it distributed properly and responsibly to the people who need it, and that's the challenge that is a huge challenge that faces Israel right now.
Indeed, and you just mentioned a power vacuum, within Israel. Is the turmoil and chaos...
power vacuum, political vacuum.
Political vacuums, apologies. But we did see Benny Gantz here, and the Israeli Prime Minister was not happy necessarily about that. Why Benny Gantz is here meeting with Lord Cameron and also meeting with Kamala Harris. We're seeing the daily protests in Israel as well. There is an inner turmoil internally about how all this is being handled as well.
Yeah, I think that Israel does not have a very stable government at the moment. You've got Netanyahu in power, you have some far-right elements, unfortunately, in the cabinet. And Netanyahu is really in a very precarious political position. I think this is slowing the decision-making when it comes to the day after the war. And I think, as I said earlier, really we could do with those decisions being made much more quickly so that we can begin to see a shape of what Gaza after the war is going to look like. Is it going to be, as I said, local clans being involved in running Gaza? If so, let's get them up and running, distributing some aid. Or is it going to be another plan?
Jasmine, I mean, there's so many things that need to be dealt with, including, I mean, we were told on March the 10th, as Ramadan was starting, that there needed to be some kind of truce, a ceasefire. That is still all up in the air, where both sides are not agreeing. There's still 100, from what we know, hostages being held in Gaza, and God knows what access to food they have alongside the rest of the population of Gaza. There are so many layers that need to be dealt with this conflict.
Absolutely. And it's, the hostages, for 5 months now have been there being moved from one place to the other, not knowing if they were going to live or die the next day. But I want to pick up on something Jake said, because Jake is right. There is no planning for the day after. There is a vacuum in Israel, and there are no plans to figure out where do we go from here. But I'll take that one step further, and I'll just say that it's because Prime Minister Netanyahu doesn't want there to be a day after plan. He is stalling, he's dragging his feet. He knows that the day after could potentially mean that he's not prime minister anymore. He doesn't want to move things forward. And to tie it back to the negotiations and to the Ramadan deadline, now negotiations have completely stalled, and that's partly because Hamas wants Israel to commit to a full ceasefire. Not right away, but once the 3 phases of the negotiated pauses are done. So the idea is you do an initial pause of 45 days, you do the hostage exchange for the prisoners, and that's a whole separate kind of, mini negotiation. And then you do a second round and then a third round. But the idea is what they were proposing is that throughout these entire 3 phases, there are talks so that once the 3 phases are done, you have a full ceasefire agreed upon. Now, Netanyahu is saying, as soon as the hostages are released and the ceasefire is over, we're going to go into Rafah, We're going to continue operations. And so here's where we're stuck. So if you're Hamas, for example...
And just briefly, I've got 30 seconds.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I mean, what you're basically saying is that Hamas wants to survive, and that's what it comes down to. Hamas wants to survive so we can do October the 7th again, and so we can be locked into a cycle of endless war.
I think
if Hamas survives, then this war will be dwarfed by what comes in the future. They've got to be finished off, and they've got to be finished off now.
2 seconds.
Sorry,
The only way Hamas survives if there's a continued occupation and no two-state solution. Bottom line.
Jasmine, Jake, thank you both for joining us here on the programme. Now, Iraq's president has given a rare interview to Sky News in which he describes what's happening in Gaza as a genocide. You'll remember the International Court of Justice stopped short of that determination in a ruling earlier this year. But speaking from the presidential palace, Abdul Latif Jamal Rashid has told our special correspondent Alex Crawford that the international community, including the UK government, should be applying more pressure on Israel. Have a listen.
I blame the people who are attacking Gaza first, and those who are supporting the continuation of the attacks and the war. I think the international community is responsible for putting an end to the suffering of children and civilians in Gaza. I think it's the duty of the international community to put an end to this suffering, and I think those who are responsible for continuation of the war are quite obvious. Those are against the United Nations resolutions. They are against the resolutions which insist on stopping the crimes against Gaza people. But yet, they allow it to continue, and they make all sorts of excuses for continuation of the suffering of the Palestinian people.
You're talking about America, who's voted consistently against any Security Council resolution to bring about a ceasefire.
Well, that's a reality. They have.
Britain's also abstained.
That's right.
You have big links with Britain. You studied in Manchester, Liverpool, and a range of other universities in Britain. What's your feeling about the British involvement here?
Extremely disappointed. Extremely disappointed. And the demonstrations in the street of London and other places in United Kingdom show that even in Parliament, the argument on ending suffering of the Palestinian people. But unfortunately, the Prime Minister and the British government is still ignoring all these requests, and they still continue on not recognizing the state of Palestinian people.
What about the neighbouring Arab states, though? Because we regularly hear Gazans themselves criticising the lack of protection which they felt was guaranteed from their neighbours.
Well, they have every right to ask for protection, the Palestinians. Whether it's from Arab countries, whether it's from other countries, they have every right to protest it. But this Palestinian issue has not only become a political issue, it has become an emotional issue in the entire region.
But should they bear some of the responsibility, these neighbouring Arab governments? Even your own, one might argue.
I think all the countries in the world, except some, we have to respect the Palestinian rights, and we have to work for protections of Palestinian people.
Before we go on to talk about various things happening in Iraq, I wanted to ask you about the question of war crimes that's going on potentially in that area. Other key leaders from Jordan, Qatar, even Turkey have been very vocal in calling them war crimes. I think the Iraqi authorities have called it genocide. What do you stand by that, and what do you think needs to happen now? We've got South Africa leading the charge against the International Court of Justice.
Iraq, we fully support South African action, and we hope that the final decision on Israeli come out in favor of Palestinian people and condemning Israelis. And I think it's very important for international community to support South African decision, and we in Iraq, obviously, we think the genocide has been committed and human rights in every aspect of it has been abused.
What about the Israeli hostages held in Gaza? Because clearly there are many claims that that is a war crime, and that is a war crime.
Well, I will leave that for negotiation to take place. I don't know how many hostages have been killed and how many are there, and the negotiation, even the official figures doesn't give the right figures. So I leave that for the negotiation between the groups which are committed to negotiation between the two sides.
Okay. Let's talk about what's happening in your country now, in Iraq, because what's happening in Gaza has had a ripple effect across the whole region, and it's had a very destabilizing effect, one might say, from the outside looking in on what's happening here. You've had an ally of yours, one of your key allies, America, basically carrying out an assassination of one of the commanders of Kataib Hezbollah, who is under the umbrella of the Iraqi government, whilst at the same time you've got claims that Iranian-backed armed groups are also launching attacks from Iraqi soil. How worried are you about all of this?
We are condemning all these attacks, and we are not happy about any attacks from Iraq or on Iraq. Obviously, the Gaza problem has affected many countries, not only in Middle East, even outside Middle East. Look, it has affected Yemen, it has affected Lebanon, it has affected Syria, it has affected Red Sea, and it had affected even shipping. So it has affected economical situation, commercial situation, and at the same time, political situation in the area. Obviously, we are very much concerned, and until this problem is solved completely for a better future, I'm afraid the tension in the region will remain.
That was the Iraqi president speaking to our Alex Crawford. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. It's International Women's Day tomorrow. Coming up, we hear the stories of 3 women caught up in conflict in Sudan, Ukraine and Afghanistan. Welcome back. Tomorrow is International Women's Day. To mark that occasion, we wanted to give you a voice to some of those caught up in conflict right now. People you often don't hear from. Here's the story of 3 women: Anna in Ukraine, Suzanne in Sudan, and Pavan in Afghanistan.
I'm Pavan Sedali, Country Director of Women for Women International in Kabul, Afghanistan.
My name is Anna. I'm a project coordinator at Andreev Family Foundation. Currently, I'm at the cemetery because I often come to visit my friend here.
I'm here at work. It's quiet these days. Women aren't coming to the office. In our case, they're not allowed. We're always in triage. We're trying to get out of triage. Hello, Manila John. How are you? I'm fine. Oh, good to see you.
Many Ukrainian women are at the front line now. They are fighting. All women in Ukraine live in constant stress because of missile and drone attacks, because of fear for their relatives and friends who are currently at the front line.
Business lot na de na moro na mo te dinero business lot ay galing ta lo business lot ko koro judo yala asa tnar ko nam do roba ngaji sukulu bona roba ngaji kala adenyo teri ka para na robi ngaji kala ko yak ne anago nyosu na lenye anago ngaji mindo book ngaji mindo yimpo ngaji mindo pen adogele gele ngoto na pan ngoto ala lo gudo aya tnar ko yak ne kilo ka karang da mai konda nyo.
It's such a beautiful country. I think one of the things that's so sad is that most women are behind closed doors. It's been a while that we just don't see, women out in public life anymore. Parks are closed to them, gyms are closed to them. As we all know, secondary education is closed, university is closed, offices are closed. So what you can't see in the air is this deep sadness that millions of talented women are feeling, not being able to use their talents.
During 2 years of war, Andreev Family Foundation faced terrible cases of rape of women and children. It is very hard to describe atrocities that were committed by Russian soldiers. Rapes, tortures, murders, shootings.
We say stronger women, stronger nations, and it's not possible for our country to move forward when 52% of its population can't fully contribute.
Well, as you saw there, women and girls are often targeted in conflict zones. I've been speaking to the musician and activist Annie Lennox. Her NGO called The Circle today wrote an open letter to Downing Street calling for stronger action against gender-based violence and a return to the UK spending of 0.7% of GDP on overseas aid. She told me she wants to use her platform to make change. Have a listen.
I am an activist and an advocate for women's rights, and I describe myself as a global feminist because I feel that the movement for women needs to have an outward view. It needs to be a collective that goes all the way around the world. So every single day for me is Women's Day.
Annie, do you feel, in all the years that you've been campaigning, that things are slowly moving and changing, or do you feel things in some places are going backwards?
We also see women's rights being rolled back in countries like Iran and Afghanistan. And basically, women's lives are becoming harder, not any easier. So although in some ways in the West, since the time of the suffragettes, we have definitely made huge strides. But when we really look at it, it is very, very slow in what we call the developing world.
Women, frankly, right across the globe in Asia and Africa are often speaking up about the fact that they feel abandoned or let down by the international community. What role and responsibility does it have, and what can be done?
1 in 3 women around the world in their lifetime will be affected by violence, gender-based violence, and that is something that affects us all. And I feel that there's so much that we can do if we can galvanise together and have the solidarity and the will, we can make tremendous change.
It's quite extraordinary, actually, when you talk about that statistic there. 1 in 3 women are impacted by gender-based violence. You know, the fact that women's bodies, the bodies of girls, are used, you know, across the globe when there is upheaval or turmoil, and even when there isn't those sorts of issues, women are exposed, girls are exposed.
Yes, women and girls are at the front line, as you can see in the terrible circumstance between Palestine and Israel. You know, on both sides, there has been sexual violence against women and girls. And rape as a weapon of war is utilised everywhere, and it has been for centuries. And we need to shine a light upon that to say that it is absolutely unacceptable.
We are looking at a situation where there is a looming deadline that Israel has put, where there's, you know, talks about, well, you know, they need their hostages released in order for them to be a pause, but there is this concern around an offensive in Rafah as well, where there's a large majority of the Palestinians have now, gathered to flee the fighting in the north and central Gaza. I just want to get more of your thoughts around that and the concerns you have, because you have spoken up quite clearly and very loudly around this.
I've taken the middle ground. I don't want to take sides in this. My interest is in seeing an end to violence. That is the imperative. And the violence that we've seen starting from October 7th, there was violence, a terrible violence, and that has kicked off the most horrendous situation for Palestinian people living in Gaza and on the West Bank. And I think this is going to go down in history as one of the most memorably tragic events that have ever happened. The only thing that will serve everyone is a ceasefire. That will serve everyone well. And I'm really concerned about what might happen in the next coming days.
You've been very clear on Instagram. I mean, you've used the word genocide. You said that genocide is taking place in Gaza.
Yeah, I feel, my view is that it is genocidal.
And
I mean, it certainly looks like it.
I mean, I guess, and Israel has pushed back.
And it gives me no. And by the way, it gives me no joy to use that term, in any way, shape, or form. But I honestly feel that this needs to be called out, because what we've seen happening in Gaza is it's something that I don't think I've ever seen in my lifetime.
Are you optimistic? I mean, given everything that you see and hear, are you hopeful that change can come eventually?
Instead of just being paralysed and thinking, oh my God, this is terrible, I'd love to do something, an activist decides to act, to make change. And because you are privileged, because you are safe, it's even incumbent upon you, I feel, to make that difference. And it gives one's life purpose. This is, for me, I recognise at this stage of life that this is absolutely where my passion lies. Because I am a woman, because I am a mother, because I've had the opportunity to have education, to have healthcare, to have all these things that are so badly lacking in so many countries still around the world.
Annie Lennox, thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you.
That was Annie Lennox. Now, earlier in the week, we brought you the dramatic story of the Afghan Youth Orchestra, a group of young musicians who fled the Taliban and now live in exile in Portugal. Well, on Monday, their plans to tour UK looked to be in tatters after the Home Office denied them visas. But a U-turn was made and the show, as they say, goes on. We spoke to them earlier as they prepared for their first show in London. Have a listen.
I was happy because we work a lot, many months, and it was also that we bring Afghan music to show the British people, and also tomorrow is the Women's Day, 8th of March, and it will gonna be a good concert for the women who can study in Afghanistan, who can go outside, they can even breathe, and I feel really good. I want to prove the Taliban right that they are wrong. The women can do anything. The women can study. The women can play music. The women can work, and they can do anything.
Afghanistan is the only silent nation in the world where music is banned entirely. The people of Afghanistan are deprived of all their musical rights, rights to play music, rights to make music, rights to listen to music, and rights to make a living through music.
Music instrument is part of us. Music is part of our life. Music is very important, and the thing that Taliban is doing very horrible is they're like killing a part of a musician. It's so hard for them to live without their instruments.
The Afghan orchestra there. Well, we've got some breaking news now on the family of Philip Adams, a former NFL player who shot six people and himself dead in 2021, say they are going to sue the NFL for head injuries he suffered prior to his violent outburst. Let's go straight to our Martha Kellner, who joins me from LA. And Martha, I mean, these sorts of cases, it's a long time coming.
It is a long time coming. Just to refresh people's memories, Philip Adams was a very successful NFL player, Yalda. Between 2010 and 2016, he played for numerous teams in the NFL, the likes of the San Francisco 49ers, the New England Patriots. He was a defensive back, so sustained heavy head injuries on the field, both during his NFL career and before. In 2021, he committed the most horrific crime. He shot dead 6 people at a home in Rock Hill, South Carolina, including a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old child, before turning the gun on himself. At the time of that incident, his family said that they believed that American football had changed his personality. They believed what he did was down to his American football career. They then had his brain analysed. He was found to have an unusually severe case of CTE. CTE is a brain disease. It's linked to repetitive head trauma. We now understand just this afternoon that the family of Philip Adams, his father, Alonzo, is about to submit a wrongful death lawsuit against the NFL. It is a significant legal move, and it's against the backdrop of increasing calls to further investigate links between violent crime and head injuries. Yalda, you may remember we've reported on your show other families who say that what their children, their relatives did was due to injuries sustained on the American football field. There was a man named Noah Green who crashed into a barricade at the Capitol building not so long ago, killing a police officer. He was also found to have a case of CTE. His brain was found to have severe head trauma similar to Philip Adams. So this is a significant legal move by the family of Philip Adams. It also opens the door for further legal cases potentially to be brought against the NFL relating to this case.
Yeah, as you say, a hugely significant development in the United States tonight. Thank you so much, Martha, for that update. Well, as we said, a big developing story there in the United States. We will be following those developments very closely here on Sky News and looking at the lasting repercussions for the sport. That's all for tonight's programme. Thank you for watching. I'll see you again on Monday. Good night for now.